questions. And from calculated chess moves to our own little game of happy families, Tim Marshall joins us now. Welcome.
Thank you.
Michael, has Mr. Putin outmaneuvered the US and NATO?
Absolutely he has. And that's been made possible partly because the West has vacated the sphere. I mean, there are no ground troops. In the case of Britain, we're not even operating over Syria. And also because, you know, a year and a half ago, we had this half-baked notion that we were going to bomb Assad out of office. And now we have another half-baked notion that we're going to somehow come down on ISIL. So that has given him the opportunity. I think, actually, I'm afraid to say that I think Putin has got it right, that, you know, our recent experience is that each time we get rid of a very, very nasty dictator, what happens next is worse from our point of view. So, you know, having got rid of Saddam Hussein, what has followed in Iraq is worse. Having got rid of Gaddafi, what has followed in Libya is worse. And it follows that, you know, what is happening in Syria is worse from our point of view than Assad himself. And so I think the Russians have got that right. If you're ever going to beat terrorists on the ground, it must be on the basis of having well-established, you know, credible national figures. And each time we've swept these people out of power, each time we've knocked the pieces off the chessboard, we've left a vacuum, and chaos has ensued very much against our own interests.
Well, that's the key word, isn't it, Tim? He's spotted the vacuum. He's been very canny. He didn't rush in. He's watched this develop. Yeah. He's watched as Mr. Obama is less and less interested, more and more reluctant to get America involved. He knows that mentally Mr. Obama wants out of the Middle East altogether, but he also knows he cannot lose Mr. Assad. That's his last major Arab ally. He's lost his major ally in Egypt. He'd lost it in Iraq years ago. And so he moves. And I mean, to see these cruise missiles was quite spectacular.
They've never fired the cruise missiles in anger before. Now they have. It's a great practice zone for them. They're called calibers, and they also, that was a demonstration of power and force. And never mind Ash Carter, the US Secretary of State, saying how isolated they are. Those cruise missiles flew over two sovereign states, Iran and Iraq, both of which gave permission. So they're not that isolated.
Well, the Americans say a couple of them actually landed in Iran by mistake.
Possibly. It's possible. Go back to the beginning. You're right. He looked on for 4 years. Only when he had to move did he move. This summer, Assad's forces began to crumble. So at that point, he froze the Ukraine conflict, made himself look responsible, positioned everything into Syria, and when he, just a week before the UN General Assembly, out he comes. I'm the man with the plan. I'm the guy with the solution. You want to talk to me? And as I said in the film, the quid pro quo will be sanctions on Russia lifted, and the EU sanctions come up for renewal in January. They may not be renewed.
And when you look at the NATO response, there's nothing there to worry Mr. Putin.
Well, no, I think he calls their bluff, doesn't he, every single time. And I think it's interesting how you point out quite rightly, Tim, how he plays the long game in all of this. I think this is, the cruise missile strikes, I think is the first time since the Cold War outside the former Soviet Union borders that Russia has taken this sort of military action. And, you know, he's a canny operator. There's no doubt about that.
He can also get away with lots of things. So, I mean, looking at some of the latest reports coming out tonight, they've been using cluster bombs. Cruise missiles, we know, are pretty
unencumbered by any sort of ethics in the foreign policy.
I mean, these Syrians, everywhere they look, there are bombs falling from the sky. Americans, well, not British, French, Russians.
And the difficulty, I think, for ourselves and the US is that a few years back when we had the vote on whether we should take more direct action against Syria, it was all about Assad. Today it's very different because we're dealing with ISIL and the fragmentation of the sort of anti-Assad groups out there as well.
Well, the West has always insisted that in any settlement or any resolution, Assad must go. And indeed, that is still the formal line of the White House and of 10 Downing Street. That's not going to happen, is it?
No, the position is absolutely preposterous. I mean, as I say, something much worse has now come along. But the other half of the point I was trying to make is that, there has been an extremist problem in Syria for a very long period. I remember when I visited Syria, learning to my shock that Assad's father had killed 10,000 people. Yes. I can't remember now whether it was Homs or...
30,000 in Hama in 1982.
In a town.
who were, I think, in those days, Muslim Brotherhood.
That's right.
So, you know, we knew that these people were very, very ruthless. But of course, we've now come to understand the value of the control of extremists in this area, something which I think we did not appreciate when we were, in a rather Boy Scout way, going around getting rid of dictators because they had very bad human rights records, which of course they all do.
Should Mr. Cameron still push ahead and get a Commons vote for Britain's air war to be extended into Syria against Islamic State?
Well, he better not have a vote if he's going to lose it. If he can be certain of winning the vote, then I think he should have it. I think he's got himself into a rather unfortunate position here in saying that Britain is likely only to go to military action if it's had a vote of the House of Commons. I mean, that has never been the position historically, and I think it's very unwise for a Prime Minister to set and to stand by that precedent.
How would you vote on that, Caroline?
To be honest, Angela, I haven't made up my mind, because part of, you know, what I would want to have an answer to is what is the outcome we're looking for here, and I'm just not quite sure that, you know, we're there. And I think, you know, Michael's point about, you know, where are we now in terms of Assad's future? I mean, Russia have basically shored it up, haven't they?
Which is what
and the offensive they've taken is to buy Assad time. Obviously, it's not just the Russians, the Iranians as well involved in this too. And you know, the UN has always said there has to be a political resolution to this. Well, you know, that would serve Putin very well if the political resolution was to assure Assad a future in some form or another.
But what is the end game for Mr. Putin in this? Because he can bolster Assad in the what is essentially now the Alawite enclave, the enclave of Mr. Assad's minority tribe, and the warm water port he gets, and he gets some Marines there, he probably gets an air base as well. But bombing alone, even with cruise missiles, doesn't win back the rest of Syria for him.
No, but he's got minimum gains and maximum gains, and the minimum is to shore up the Assad, which gives all the rest. Unlike Obama, who threw Mubarak under the bus, I stand by my allies. There's one victory. He makes himself a player and gets the sanctions reduced, perhaps. Second victory. Third, keeps his port on the Mediterranean coast. Third victory. Now, the Iranians are coming in with some ground troops, Revolutionary Guard. There's going to be a bigger assault over the next 2 or 3 weeks, which will push even more refugees into the UK. The political solution is as follows. You either keep Assad, which is just not really going to happen, but he can have a figurehead role for about a year. There's a guy called Mohammed Tlass, who lives in Paris, used to be part of the regime. Bring him in, he's a Sunni, he's acceptable. So you fight your way to a stalemate, and then you get a deal. This is from the Russians' perspective. You get a deal whereby we're the big players. We'll even have the peace conference in Moscow if you want. And at that point,
the Black Sea?
Yes, anywhere that makes Russia the player of this, which is what it's all about. And the last victory you get, if this all works, I'm not saying it will work, he's just been busy prodding NATO in the chest, flying into Turkey, a NATO ally. Nothing's happened.
But he's not going to do that again, because we've sent 100 troops.
Oh, at least. Well, that's signalling by the Brits. Sorry.
You imply that bombing is only of limited utility, and obviously that's been proven again and again. But bombing must be accompanied by serious troops on the ground. Now, you know, in Iraq that was done with American forces, but what we've shown is that we're not willing to stay anywhere very long.
But the Iranians are, and they're going in.
But exactly. Yeah. So the two serious groups of forces on the ground are the Syrian army and the Iranian troops. And so in this case, Russian bombing is not so futile because it is coordinated with effective ground forces.
Along with Hezbollah as well.
Yes, that's right. Who've lost about 1,000 men there already.
But just to finish, you think, I mean, it sounds everything you're saying that Mr. Putin's calling the shots. He's got allies with Iran, he's got Hezbollah, who seem to be an ally. Even Iraq is now even sharing intelligence with the Russians, which the Americans didn't know about that. But even at the end of that, you think that he would be prepared to junk Mr. Assad, provided he got somebody else that was pro-Russian.
Absolutely. And this guy Tlass, who was the head of the Republican Guard in Syria, now living in Paris, he could be brought back in. He could be the strong man. He could be just as good a friend as Assad is, as long as he doesn't care who's in charge of Syria, as long as they're friendly to Moscow. Now, that's the future as he sees it. Like I said, it might not happen, and the petrol is being poured on the fire because the Sunni Gulf states look at this as he's protecting the Shia, and that Shia-Sunni Cold War is getting very hot, and the battleground partly is in Syria.
Tim, thank you for that. Miss you on Sky News.
God bless you.
Especially after listening to you tonight. Now it's late. Chinese